Welcome to Making Peace Visible, where we look closely at the intersection of peace, conflict, and the media. And I'm your host, Jamil Simon. At MPV, our mantra is that peace is invisible, and we want to change that. But there are aspects of war that are invisible as well. Some have been made invisible deliberately. Others we've been able to ignore. We think it's important to shine a light on the hidden costs of war. What we're going to look at in today's episode is the impact of military deployment on families, especially the children and family members of soldiers. We have two guests today who are uniquely qualified to help us see what's going on with the families of military personnel. Susan Hackley is a peace builder who's produced a compelling documentary film called Veteran Children that focuses on the impact of military service on military children and families. Susan is the former managing director of the Harvard Law School Program on Negotiation and the former board chair of the Alliance for Peace Building. I'm proud to say Susan is an old friend and I admire her work. Our second guest is Dr. Howard Kudler, worked with Susan on the film. Dr. Kudler is a psychiatrist and researcher who's become one of the leading experts on deployment mental health. Dr. Kudler has studied the impacts of long and multiple deployments on both soldiers and their children and families. So we'll start with Susan. As the film points out, there are 2 million American children who have a parent who served in the post-9/11 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria. It's not a small number, yet they are largely invisible. It's great that your film made them visible. Tell us a little bit what motivated you to make it.
You know, the wars happened after 9/11. My son, very unexpectedly, before 9/11, joined the Marines. And even more unexpectedly, was sent to war in Iraq, among the first troops into Iraq. And as his mother, I felt really disconnected from people who didn't have family members serving in the military, let alone in combat. And I wanted to do something to show the impact of war on families and to help bridge the divide between civilian population and the military and veteran population of our country. So I decided to make a short film, and I decided to focus on the children of veterans because they are uniquely experiencing the impact of war. And as you said, they are largely invisible. So I put together a team. We raised some money, and it took about 5 years. It was extremely difficult. But I'm very proud of the film and very proud to have discovered Dr. Kudler and his expertise.
Well, Susan, could you tell us more about military families? Who are they demographically or socioeconomically or geographically?
They come from all over the country and really all walks of life. Now, a lot of people assume those are young people who didn't have any other choices. My son had lots of choices after high school, and my co-producer, Martha Jackson's son, had lots of choices after high school. You're going to find men and women of all demographics there. There are really almost 3 million children who have had a parent go to war, and roughly 40% of the people in the military have young children.
Well, Dr. Kudler, in the documentary, you talked about the fact that not only do soldiers serve, but the families do. Can you talk about the range of impacts that war has on military families?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Let me start by saying a moment about how I kind of awakened to this issue. Because I was working in the VA, mostly seeing individual veterans, sometimes seeing their wives. During most of the years, I was at VA starting 1984, ending about 2018. But most of those years, these were World War II, Korea, Vietnam vets. I wasn't thinking a lot about military children. And what happened was that Congress in 1999 passed legislation that reconstituted a special committee in the VA on post-traumatic stress disorder. I was assigned to be the co-chair of that group. And the idea was to report back on everything VA was doing in terms of clinical work, research, education, benefits regarding PTSD. One day I had the opportunity to tour Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Bethesda. And the fellow in charge at that time of mental health at Walter Reed was a psychiatrist, Dr. Steve Koza. And we're touring, we're meeting different wounded soldiers and talking to staff. And it was kind of, the age group I expected to be working with. But we're walking down the hallway and we spot maybe an 11-year-old boy pushing his father in a wheelchair toward the rehabilitation room that we had just toured. And Steve and I stepped back and held the double doors open so they could go through there. And after the doors closed, Steve got up close to me and said, almost in a whisper, "Who do you think talks to these children?" And I kind of just woke up. Sure, I opened the door and I noticed the kid, but I didn't really think about what it was I was seeing. And that kind of got me started on this. And actually, Dr. Koza, who's now the director of the Center for Traumatic Stress Studies at the Uniformed Services University in Bethesda, he got me involved in a number of things, including a special edition of a journal, The Future of Children, on military children and families, getting into all these things. What I've learned is that military children do serve alongside their parents, except they're invisible. They have no uniforms. They have no official ranks, designations. What I've discovered over the years, there's actually an international, if you will, fraternal order of military kids who will talk to each other about this, and with a few select others who show an interest in them, but generally won't even talk about the experience of being military children. And when I say they serve alongside their parents, they are part of military culture. They're literally embedded in it. They're imbued with it. The issues of maintaining a strong front of good discipline and order, of being responsible, the realization that their parents will be judged by their behavior, and the need to support their parents and frankly put their own needs aside often in support of the mission is truly impressive and very powerful in their lives. But they don't get a lot of research because they're so good at being invisible.
There's another aspect of it that you talked about is military parents serving on multiple deployments. You pointed to the contrast between serving in the military in the post 9/11 wars compared to earlier episodes of American history, which was very different.
The fact is that if you go back and talk to the children of World War II and Korean War veterans, you hear a lot of similar stories. It's just that they're buried very deep. I'll tell you from my own family, my mother's father died in World War II. He had joined the Army Medical Corps and then had a series of heart attacks during the invasion of North Africa, or just after. He was serving in Casablanca and died shortly after. And to the end of her life, she talked about him. She was very proud of him. But one of the last things she did in her life when she knew she was dying is she submitted a history of her father to a compendium, a memorial book of war orphans. And I never thought my mother considered herself a war orphan. She just never talked about it. But, when kids are growing up in an age of instantaneous communication, when they can talk to their parents in a war zone, in real time, it changes everything. When all their kids are watching the news, but they may be the only military child in their class, in their school. When they're coping with the stress economic or the stress on their non-deployed parent who may or may not be a military person, a lot of them have both parents who are in the military, they know that there are things they can't discuss with their peers, which isolates them even more. Their pediatricians may know nothing about it. They may be paid by TRICARE, but those pediatricians don't necessarily have any background in military culture. The only requirement to be a TRICARE provider is that you have a license. And so you might be a child of a National Guard member, and 40% of the people who served in Iraq and Afghanistan were in the reserve component, either members of the reserves or a member of the National Guard. You may be living in the mountains of North Carolina. You're seeing a pediatrician. You're getting pretty good insurance because you have a deployed parent. But that pediatrician knows nothing and may not ask you anything, may not even know you have a deployed parent. They may wonder why you're having trouble sleeping or why a young child has gone back to bedwetting. Your principal may wonder, why is this kid acting out? He never acted out before. Why is he in my office all the time? And they may not even realize, well, perhaps it has to do with the stress of a parent being deployed and another parent being on the ropes, and maybe they aren't getting their usual income into the household that they did because he was a banker, but now he's a sergeant, and you don't get paid the same. These are complexities that we had to learn a lot about very quickly.
Susan, the children spoke very openly about what they saw and how they suffered and what kinds of impacts it had. There's so many memorable comments, but this one girl said, I had different responsibilities, but I just really wanted to be an 11-year-old and run around. That kind of thing was denied.
So I did grow up fast, and I did get more serious in life than a lot of other kids. So it's one of those things, it's like, do I regret doing it? No, because it made me grow up and it made me a stronger person. But it did suck. I wanted to be an 11-year-old. I wanted to go run around and do other things, but my dad was more important.
Her father had been badly wounded, and she's looking back. She's a little older in the film. I wasn't surprised at how eloquent and candid the children would be when we asked them these questions. And I wasn't surprised that they hadn't talked about these things. We did one filming in Indiana where we brought together 10 children. 4 of them had parents who were deployed, and the other 6 didn't have any experience of that, but came with some questions. The children whose parents were at war, had been at war, gave wonderful answers.
Does it bother you, or does it comfort you when, like, your friend or something says, oh, my parent can substitute for your parent while he or she is away?
My friend's dad, he was always there asking me if you want to throw the football or if you want to work on any of your skills or anything. So that comforted me a lot.
There's no explanation for why they're not talking to you or answering your calls or anything. How do you guys deal with that?
I just usually think that he's probably doing something important and he has his mind on other things that he needs to get done.
Afterwards, the grandparents and parents who had brought the children there and were back in the shadows in the back of the film studio said, oh, I had no idea my grandchild had these ideas and thoughts and fears.
I was asking about multiple deployments. I think we deploy soldiers far more often or more frequently than was done historically in previous wars. Is that right?
In World War II, people were deployed for the duration, so once they signed in, they were going to be there for the war. And I think it was pretty similar in Korea. In Vietnam, people were deployed for 365-day tours. Marines, like Susan's son, would have gone for 13 months instead of 12 because they're Marines. And then they were always going to do a little bit more. But the idea was that it was a good idea to limit the length of the deployment. In these wars, it was unique because we were deploying people for 12 months. There were then times when they would hold people in service longer, maybe 15 months, maybe longer. But some units, including the Marine units, were deploying every 6 months, coming and going. I remember meeting a little girl at Camp Lejeune who was 9 years old, and her father had deployed 6 times in her lifetime to a combat area. And she was a great kid and a great trooper, but there was no question, that she was paying a price. It was a sacrifice. By the way, I want to make one thing very clear. I'm a psychiatrist. I've mentioned PTSD. Being a military child is not a mental disorder. It's not a pathology of any sort. It's really something to be very proud of. And these kids often reach a level of maturity at a very young age. They perform very well, and they sacrifice willingly and knowingly for a cause. There's a great deal that's very noble, and there's a great deal to be respected. So I want to be clear to anybody viewing this that they should understand we're not pathologizing the experience of being a military child, but we do want to emphasize the importance of recognizing them and appreciating them. And that's still a challenge. There's an organization called the Military Child Education Coalition, largely led by military parents or former military parents, including some very high-ranking ones. They've been trying for years to get every public school in America to have, when a child registers for school, the question, is someone in the family a member of the military? so that they can be prepared to ask questions if they notice a change or a problem or stress in the kid. And that really has not succeeded at the national level at all. Partly because schools don't always feel comfortable getting into things they don't need to get into, or they feel they don't need to. But also partly because many military parents would probably object to reporting this. They'd wonder, why is the school, a civilian program, asking this question? Is it a good thing for me to say? Is it going to make life better for my child or worse for my child? I bring this up to show how complicated the issue is, the interface between our military population and our civilian population.
Dr. Kudler, you're an expert on post-traumatic stress disorder. Can you explain what actually goes on in the brain of someone with PTSD?
Well, one question to start with, is it in the brain or in the mind? Or how do you separate those two things? They're kind of inseparable. But, PTSD is a condition that follows a person being exposed to some overwhelmingly stressful situation. People talk about, is it fear? Is it horror? Personally, I don't think it's fear. I think the stressor itself can be understood as a situation that just overcomes your capacity to adapt, to cope, to even take in what's happening to you. And, when you're a military person, you are trained to respond in the way that you were trained in basic training. But even so, sometimes the situation can be so horrendous. It might involve, say, the death of a friend, a very close friend, maybe right next to you, some terrible threat to your life. You have to have this level of stress, or something. They used to use the phrase beyond the realm of normal human experience. And then some of the problems you may have after that would be intrusive thoughts, intrusive memories, images. Sometimes they can be so powerful, you don't know if this is happening again, or is this here, or is it then? Time collapses, what's called a flashback. You might also feel a need to avoid reminders, loud places, crowded places, places that have some reminder of the situation you were in. The third part is this physiologic hyperactivity, hyperarousal. Your heart races, you startle easily, you jump, you can't sleep. Can't maintain deep sleep. You sleep with one eye open. And basically, a group of changes in mood and thinking, so that you tend to view the world pessimistically. While most of us, I think, like to have at least some optimism that this may work out, a lot of people with PTSD just don't see things working out, and they easily fall into depression and substance use. So that's the basic picture of PTSD.
According to the Brown University Cost of War Project, at least 4 times as many U.S. service members and veterans of post-9/11 wars died by suicide than in combat. That's an amazing statistic. You've done extensive research on veteran suicides. Why do you think the rate of suicide is so high, and what do you think can be done to bring it down?
It's such a big question, and so many good people are doing good work on this. But I'll tell you my personal answer to this. Suicide is an extreme of isolation. When you don't fit in, when you don't see, your relevance to other people or other people's relevance to you, when there are things about you you feel other people could not understand, and you may not be able to bring yourself to share. And the fact is that when people come back from a war, people don't know what to say or do or how to act around them. In a way, they come to feel like they're haunting their old lives. They may be back with their family, they may be back at work, but they just don't feel like they belong. A lot of people go back and choose to deploy again because at least they knew the rules. They belonged. They knew what to do. Their identity was clear. And at home, they don't get it anymore, especially when you think about the kids. I had a child who was 6 months old when I left, and now I have a 1-year-old. I don't know this child. They don't know me. Am I a good parent? Is this child ever going to be able to love me? Paradoxically, it's the love of the child and the wish to be loved by the child that leads to this desperation that leads them often to leave the family behind again.
And I would just add, one thing that would help would be if the military would be more allowing of soldiers and veterans with disturbing thoughts to get help. And lots been said about that, and I think some progress has been made, but heretofore there'd been a stigma attached. If you asked for help, for therapy or counseling, you were perceived as weak and could feel like it would hurt your career.
Thinking about that, I mean, Susan, do you have any thoughts about people who aren't connected to the military? How can they connect to military families?
Yeah, it's a great question. And they could talk to someone at their school and say, gee, do you think we could find some military families here? Or at the church. I've given a talk about my film at a couple of churches. So just bringing in the discussion, whether it's through showing a short film like mine where everybody can see it and hear the voices of those children.
That's always a good conversation starter.
It's a good conversation starter. Or having a veteran or a family member of a veteran come in and share some experiences. It comes back to what you said at the beginning is making it visible. And it's up to us as civilians to just go out and get started in our own communities and see if you can meet some people and maybe start a discussion.
Well, speaking about the screenings, I mean, tell us a little more about where it's been screened and how it's been received in different communities.
Well, we were so lucky that the film was released in 2019. We had a number of screenings in Washington, D.C., at Harvard University here in Massachusetts, at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans on Veterans Day, at independent movie theaters. We've been shown in film festivals around the world. We have the film available on our website. Anybody can look at it, no password, no fee. And we find people write to us and they just kind of found it and they've shared it with others. So that's what we want to do is it can be a conversation starter and it usually leads to really good discussions and there's no partisanship. Everybody's seeing these amazing children. And there's no other film like it where they have the children talking. Most of the film is children talking.
And you have personally, I mean, you have a foot in both worlds in a sense. Your son is a veteran Marine Corps infantryman who was in Iraq, and you're already working in the peace building field. So what was that like for you as a parent when he signed up?
It was so hard. He was all set to go to college and he joins the Marines instead. So I'm saying, why are you joining the Marine Corps? Why don't you join the Peace Corps? But I had no thought that there'd be a war. This was back in 2000 and we have 9/11. And then when he was deployed to Iraq in 2003, it was so awful because I was so against the war. Yet I'm the mother of this young man who's going in among the very first over the border of Kuwait into Iraq. And I didn't want to say anything that would impact him. But I'm also in the conflict resolution field, as you are, Jamil.
Right.
And everyone was so detached from the reality of war. Of course, they're all against the war, but I was like the poster child of somebody who actually had some skin in the game.
Right.
It was extremely difficult and painful. But that's why I wanted to make the film. I had to do something.
Dr. Kudler, I'd like to go back to something you said that military children sometimes have advantages. In other words, maybe they've achieved a level of maturity that kids their age haven't achieved. Tell us about what you've seen in terms of strengths or advantages with children with military parents.
Well, consider that these children have often lived all over the world. On average, a military member will undergo what's called a permanent change in station, a PCS, and move from one station to another around the country, around the world. And they'll stay there for another 2 years. And you can learn a great deal becoming a citizen of the world. You often meet extraordinary people, some in the military and some who are your peers in those other nations that you get to know. They've made strong bonds with other military kids. Another point, something that I learned from my co-author on one of the articles I wrote, she was an Army colonel and had access to a lot of military records. She looked back to see what percentage of children in the active duty military, this is about 2014, had parents who were service members. It turned out to be 57%. Of everyone serving an active duty in the U.S. Army, and that's our largest military group, 57%. And that speaks to something invisibly unknown to most of us. There is a dynasty, a military dynasty in America. These are not people who are controlling us in any way. I don't mean like that. These are the people who are protecting us and serving us. And there is a sense of mission passed down from generation to generation. And I think that reflects a maturity, a strength, a devotion, a sense of duty. Not everybody, signs that blank check to the government. It's something that gives me tremendous respect for military children, and frankly, their military parents who raised them.
This is a question I'd like to ask both of you. What do you wish more peace builders and the general public knew about members of the military and their families?
I would like the peace building community to engage more person to person, not just read about it, not just form opinions about it, but see the great variety and diversity of people in the military, the great sense of service and honor, learn what they think about different things. Our military is still deployed in dangerous places around the world, and we don't read about it every day. You read about it if something goes really wrong, but they are deployed. They're in danger, a lot of them. And I needed to do more of that myself. I just think we all need to get to know each other better and then have good conversations. And again, I think it can start with the children in their schools.
Dr. Kudler, what about you?
Yeah, if I could get my wish, I would help the American people recalibrate their understanding of the footprint of the military in America. It's been said a lot that less than 1% of Americans are in the military, and that's true. At this moment, people in the active duty component, and you can throw in the reserve component, are about 1%. But if you then add in the 19 million living American veterans, and if you consider that on average, everyone who served in the military has at least 1.5 dependents who live with them or have lived with them and may well be eligible for VA benefits, it turns out that about 1 out of 6 Americans would answer the question, have you or someone close to you served in the military? 1 out of 6 Americans would answer yes. This is a huge footprint, and it can't be ignored, but it usually is ignored. It certainly isn't 1%.
Also, our special point of view is always looking at the media. And what do you think the media is missing about life in the military, if you want to call it that?
Everything.
Everything.
I mean, you look at what gets all the attention now.
Right. Bombs and bullets.
We know. Well, bombs and bullets and controversy. What's the latest thing our leaders have said?
Yeah, I'd add that it's difficult because, first of all of us carry ideas and images from movies and books about the war, and we have some ideas. So many of us, whatever our adult feelings might be, grew up playing soldier, and this is kind of deep inside of us. But military people have their own culture, and they guard that culture. As a doctor, we have a medical culture, and we have the similarity of life and death issues, and we're there at times that are extreme that most people are not. And we have our own way of covering up and our own sense of humor about it, our own sense of seriousness about it, things that we can't share even with peers. And so that kind of helps me relate a little bit when I meet military people. There's a part of me that wants to break down barriers, and there's a part of me that realizes the importance of respecting barriers too, which is why, when you ask what can we do for military people, we have to start with that respect that we're greeting someone from another culture. They truly are. They may be just like us some of the time, 90% of the time, but there is this part of their lives that they are a different culture. And we start with respecting that. So before we say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, I'm going to buy donuts or whatever, find out what they would like you to do. Find out what they would find helpful. Right. Collaborate with them. It makes all the difference in the world. And I hope that more people will kind of set up time for coffee and say, what you've told me about your military experience makes me want to do something, but I wouldn't know what to do. Is there anything that I could be doing? And then when they originally say, no, there's nothing you can do, we have this covered, be patient and come back to that question in a polite way later.
I think that's really a great point. And my son is forever a Marine. It is such an important part of his identity. He's so proud to be a Marine. he feels like he has to excel at whatever he does because not to do so would reflect badly on the Marines.
Even though he's not in the Marines anymore, is that?
Right. He was in for 4 years. But there's a culture, as Harold said, and there's a pride and a sense of you will reflect well on the Marines.
There are no ex-Marines. They're very clear about that, and they absolutely mean it.
Here, looking at this issue in 2025, the news reports on some actions by the U.S. military are things like the Air Force's bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities in June, or the Navy airstrike on a boat in Venezuela that Trump said was carrying drugs, or the deployment of the National Guard in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. Is that having an impact on the way we perceive military action?
I'm afraid that most people consuming that news are not seeing those as individual soldiers and Marines, airmen doing it. It's just like a bomb fell. And I feel sad for the military being deployed in the role that should be probably taken by police. I wonder, I've been asking some people, do you know what this is doing to morale?
Yeah, you certainly can't blame our military members for what they're ordered to do, and they're going to do it well and to the best of their ability. They, unfortunately, are generally not trained to do civilian policing, to run prisons. I think when you think about building refugee holding areas on military bases, it's being done, or doing deportation. They're not trained to do that either. When you ask our military to work side by side with policemen, often in situations that could become dangerous for everyone involved, our military don't use the same hand signals. They don't, you say, cover us. The military might put down withering lethal fire, because that's what cover me means. But it doesn't mean that to the police. And we didn't mean that. So there are all kinds of dangers. I do think that military children worrying about their parents in these situations, being aware of the tensions, maybe their friends in school saying, was that your mother I saw on the news, or your father I saw on the news? I mean, this just complicates things. And I do hope for their sake that we can have a cleaner separation of what the military's job is, what the police's job is, and what our rights as citizens are, so that we don't end up with our own military taking authority over our own people.
Yeah, I'm really glad we talk about that, because it is kind of frightening what's going on.
Could I say one more thing?
Of course.
When I decided to make this film, I felt conflicted, because I thought we're at war with Iraq and Afghanistan, and the children in those countries are suffering. Why should we focus on American children? But I felt like if I focused on American children, Americans would pay attention. And I've had friends from other countries like Israel, Rwanda, elsewhere say, we need this in our country. Ask in Israel, what is the impact of these prolonged wars and danger and conflict doing to the children? I think it's a way for people to take very seriously all the impacts of war, to broaden that discussion. I think that's healthy.
I'm glad we had a chance today to look at some of the hidden costs of war, because there are a lot of things that we're just not seeing. Anyway, I want to thank both of you for being so generous with your thoughts and your knowledge and expertise.
Thank you, Jamil, so much for inviting us.
Yes, thank you. And this is not going to go out of style for a very long time.
You can watch Susan Hackley's documentary, Veteran Children, at veteranchildren.com. We've got links in the show notes to resources for veteran families. You can also find some of Dr. Harold Kudler's research on veteran mental health and PTSD, and his guidelines on building communities of care for military children and families. Making Peace Visible is produced by Andrea Maraskin. The associate producer is Faith McClure, and I'm Jamil Simon. If you like what you heard, please give us a rating and review in Apple Podcasts, or leave a rating and comment on Spotify. It helps other people find our show, and we love to know what you think.